There has been a significant change to penalty enforcement for the upcoming season. Although there are many shaded areas and amendments in Rule 10, the changes focus on one thing: significantly limiting the penalties that can be enforced from behind the neutral zone. Information about the new rule has mostly centered on offensive fouls behind the neutral zone, but as we'll see, the true focus is much more about where enforcement occurs. Here's what the new rule does. It eliminates excessive offensive penalties, it eliminates lenient defensive penalties, but it keeps punitive penalties for a small class of offensive fouls. Now, the new rule accomplishes this by limiting penalty enforcement to no further back than the previous spot, with just a few exceptions. The rule is not intended to change long understood and common penalty enforcement in other situations. In fact, most penalties can still be enforced under the all but one principle, which I'll call the old rule. So going forward, it may help to think of the new rule as simply a limitation principle to the old rule. Now, if you've been studying Rule 10, paying attention to every word, and keeping up with National Federation's updates, you'll realize that some of the things I'm about to say are not stated in Rule 10. That's because some of the wording in the rule just isn't very clear. This was a major change in penalty enforcement philosophy, and when major changes are made, sometimes the wording that gets used is imprecise and incomplete. That happened here. If we were to enforce every penalty according to the exact wording in the book, we would end up with some unintended, unfair, and in some situations, some really strange results that would not be in keeping with the underlying purposes of the rule. So, to avoid those situations, we are going to clarify some of the words in Rule 10. First, ignore completely Rule 10.4.5e, f, and g. Applying the situations literally in those provisions would lead to unintended and unfair enforcements in some situations. So if those situations occur, the basic spot is the end of the related run, as stated in 10.4.8, and just enforce under the basic all but one principle, but limited by the previous spot. Next, apply the all but one principle for 10.4.5d, 10.4.6, and for the momentum exception. If the offense fouls behind the succeeding spot, which is the 20, or the momentum spot, then penalize from the spot of the foul. Next, 10.4.7 and 10.5.2 as written apply only after a change of team possession. If the situations in those provisions occur before a change of possession, enforce the penalty from the previous spot. Finally, the spot foul enforcements listed in 10.4.4 are limited to offensive penalties. There are no defensive spot fouls. Remember, these clarifications are not intended to change the rule. They are intended to help realize the full purpose of the rule change and to correctly enforce penalties. So here's a short intro into penalty enforcement for the upcoming year. Earlier I mentioned you could still use the all but one principle, or the old rule, for many penalty enforcements. And of course now we have the new rule as well. So which do you use? It depends on which of two categories of fouls occurs. First, for live ball fouls during scrimmage downs and before a change of possession, we're going to use the new rule. All other fouls can be enforced under the old rule and under the traditional all but one principle. Let's first talk about penalty enforcement under the new rule. Remember, this applies only for fouls occurring during scrimmage plays and prior to a change of team possession. Here's the general principle. Nothing is ever enforced from behind the neutral zone except a foul by Team A in its own end zone, which brings the option of a safety, or a foul by Team A in the offensive backfield for one of the following: illegal forward pass, intentional grounding, illegal kicking, illegal batting, illegal participation by a player participating without his helmet, or illegal participation by a player entering the field of play during the down. For all of these fouls, the penalty is enforced from the spot of the foul. Now let's talk about enforcement for all other fouls during the game. It's simple. Enforce it the same way you did last year. Use the basic all but one, 3-and-1 enforcement under the old rule. Here's a visual checklist that may help you decide whether and how to enforce a penalty under the new rule. The first thing to remember is that new rule enforcement is limited to live ball fouls treated as live ball fouls. If non-player fouls or unsportsmanlike fouls happen during the down, those are not penalized under the new rule. They are penalized always as they had been in the past. You enforce them from the succeeding spot. Enforcing a penalty under the new rule requires that there be a when and a where component. If the when and the where are present, there are 3 enforcement possibilities. Let's first talk about the when component. This relates to when the foul occurs. The foul must occur during a scrimmage down and prior to any change of team possession. Both of these must exist for the when. The where component relates to where something happened. Either the related run needed to end behind the neutral zone, or the offense needs to have fouled behind the neutral zone. You only need one of these for the where component. If the when and the where are both present, then you can enforce the penalty according to the new rule. There are 3 enforcement options, and you should consider the enforcement options in the order we'll show next. Once an enforcement option applies, you can enforce the penalty, and you don't need to look for another option. The first enforcement option is available when the offense fouls in its own end zone. In that situation, there is the option for a safety. But remember, if it's on a kicking play, Team R can enforce the Team K penalty from where Team R will next put the ball in play. The second enforcement option is available when the offense fouls in the offensive backfield for intentional grounding, illegal forward pass, illegal kicking, illegal batting, illegal participation by a player with a helmet off, or illegal participation by a player entering the field during a down. Under this option, the penalty is enforced from the spot of the foul. If the first 2 enforcement options are not available, then go with enforcement 3, which will be the normal situation. The penalty is enforced from the previous spot, and this applies to fouls by both the offense and defense. If you don't have a when and a where, don't try to apply one of these 3 enforcement options. Instead, for all other fouls, apply the enforcement as you have in previous years. Basic all but one enforcement under the old rule. Now that we've got this chart in place, let's go over a few play examples. For all of these case plays, the foul is a live ball foul treated as a live ball foul. In this example, A has a 1st and 10 from its own 30-yard line. Quarterback A1 is sacked for a loss behind the neutral zone at the A25. During the play, A77 holds the defense behind the neutral zone at the A27. Team B accepts the penalty. Last year under the old rule, this would have resulted in a 1st and 25 at the A15 because the penalty would have been enforced from the end of the related run, which was behind the neutral zone. So let's see if the new rule applies this year. Well, do we have a when component? Yes, we do. The foul occurred during the scrimmage down and prior to change of possession. Is there a where component? Yes, we actually have both of these satisfied here. The run ended behind the neutral zone and the offense fouled behind the neutral zone. So which enforcement do we want to take a look at? Going in order. Is enforcement 1 an option? No, it's not, because the foul did not occur in the offensive end zone. How about enforcement 2? No, because the holding foul is not one of those specific fouls that brings a spot foul enforcement. That leaves us with enforcement 3. Enforce the penalty from the previous spot, which results this year in a ruling of A playing 1st and 20 at the A20. For this example, Team A is playing 3rd and 10 from its own 30-yard line. The quarterback drops deep in the pocket trying to find a passer. As he's being rushed, the quarterback from within the pocket throws a forward pass from the A23, which is behind the neutral zone, to an area without an eligible receiver. This is a foul for intentional grounding, and Team B accepts the penalty. Last year, this would have resulted in 4th and 22 from the A18. The penalty would have been enforced from the spot of the foul, which was the offensive foul behind the basic spot. Does the new rule apply? Well, we do have a when component. The foul happened during the scrimmage down and prior to a change of possession. We also have the where component. An illegal forward pass is considered part of a running play, and the run did end behind the neutral zone, but additionally, the offense also fouled behind the neutral zone. So what are our enforcement options? Enforcement 1 is not available because the foul did not occur in the offensive end zone. However, enforcement 2 is available because this was an offensive foul by the offense in the backfield for one of the specially listed fouls. specifically intentional grounding. As a result, we're going to enforce this penalty from the spot of the foul. And because we have that enforcement available, we don't need to think about the previous spot enforcement. So under this year's new rule, A will play 4th and 22 at the A18 after enforcing the penalty from the spot of the foul under 10.4.4c. For this play, Team A is snapping from its 30-yard line. The running back runs to the 50-yard line, and during the run, Team A holds beyond the neutral zone at the A35. Team B accepts the holding penalty. Last year, this would have resulted in A playing 3rd and 15 at the A25 because we would have enforced the penalty from the spot of the foul under the 3-and-1 principle. Does the new rule apply? Well, we do have the when component. The foul occurred during a scrimmage down and prior to a change of possession. However, we don't have the where component. Here, the run ended beyond the neutral zone, and the offense fouled beyond the neutral zone. Because we don't have both the when and the where, we will not enforce under the new rule, and we don't have to consider those enforcement options. Instead, enforce the same way as you did last year under the all but one principle, and this will result in A playing 3rd and 15 from the A25, the same as last year. The last few play examples have involved offensive fouls. Let's take a look at an example with a defensive foul. Here, A is playing 3rd and 10 from its own 30-yard line. The quarterback is sacked for a 10-yard loss at the A20. However, during the play, the defense held a wide receiver. Team A accepts the penalty for defensive holding. Last year, we would have enforced this spot from the end of the run, which was 10 yards in the backfield. That was the basic spot, and it would have resulted in A replaying 3rd and 10 from the A30. How does the new rule affect this? Well, we have a when component. The foul occurred during a scrimmage down and prior to a change of possession. We also have the where component because the related run ended behind the neutral zone. So what enforcement options are available? Well, the first one is not because the foul for defensive holding is obviously not an offensive foul in the offensive end zone. Similarly, it's not an offensive foul in the backfield for one of the special fouls. That leaves us with enforcement 3. The penalty is enforced from the previous spot. Even though it's a defensive foul, this rule still applies and we will enforce from the previous spot. As a result, this year, Team A will play 1st and 10 at the A40. Here's another case play with a defensive foul. A is snapping from its own 10-yard line. The quarterback retreats deep into his own end zone where he is tackled by the face mask. Team A accepts the penalty for the personal foul. Last year, we would have enforced this foul from the goal line under 10.4.7 and 10.5.2 as written. This would have resulted in A playing a 3rd and 5 at the A15. So how does the new rule change things? Well, we do have a when component. The foul occurred during a scrimmage down and prior to a change of possession. We also have the where component. The related run ended behind the neutral zone. So what are our enforcement options? Well, obviously, it's not going to be enforcement 1 because the defensive personal foul for face mask is not an offensive foul in the end zone. It's also not an offensive foul in the backfield for one of the special fouls. That leaves our enforcement 3, the previous spot. So even though the run ended in the end zone, the defensive foul will be penalized from the previous spot, and this year A will play 1st and 10 at the A25. Let's talk about a kicking play. A is snapping from its own 5-yard line on 4th down, and the punter punts from his own end zone. The defense catches the punt at the 50 and returns the ball to the A20-yard line where he is tackled. However, before the kick, A5 held B2 in Team A's end zone. Last year, this would have resulted in a safety or the possibility of a tack on to the end of the kick return. How does the new rule impact it? Well, the foul did occur during a scrimmage down, and it did occur prior to the change of possession. It also occurred behind the neutral zone, so the when and the where are here. What are our enforcement options? Going left to right, we see that enforcement 1 is possible. The foul was by the offense in the offensive end zone, so the option for a safety is there. Of course, Team R can also enforce the penalty from where it will next put the ball in play. But because this enforcement option is available, we don't need to go any further. So this year, under the new rule, the result of the penalty enforcement will either be a safety or Team R can play 1st and goal at the A10 after enforcing from the dead ball spot. In this last play example, Team A has a 1st and 10 from the B20-yard line. B99 intercepts the pass at the 6-yard line. He fumbles the ball into his own end zone, where a teammate recovers the ball 5 yards deep in the end zone. At that point, A10 tackles that teammate by the face mask. Where do we enforce the face mask penalty from? Last year, we would have enforced it from the goal line, and B would have played 1st and 10 at the B15. How does the new rule change things? Well, right off the bat, we can see that we don't have the when component. Although the penalty occurred during a scrimmage down, it did not occur prior to the change of possession. The face mask foul occurred after the defense possessed the ball. Therefore, the new rule enforcement provision does not apply, and we don't need to worry about any of the other possible enforcements. Instead, enforce this penalty as you did last year and under the clarification we talked about for 10-4-7 and 10-5-2. This foul is enforced from the goal line, and Team B will have a new series from the B15. There is another way to think about penalty enforcement, and that is to first apply last year's all but one principle for all penalties in your head. If you do that, and the enforcement spot would be from behind the neutral zone, ask these 3 questions. Is the foul a live ball foul treated as a live ball foul? Did the foul occur during a scrimmage down? And did the foul occur before a change of team possession? If the answer to any of those 3 questions is no, then enforce the penalty under the all but one principle, just as you would have last year. But if the answers to all 3 of those questions are yes, then the new rule applies. In that case, enforce the penalty under the new rule as follows. If the team foul was a Team A foul in Team A's end zone, the result is a safety, unless the kicking option applies. If the foul was a Team A foul in the backfield for one of those 6 special fouls listed, then enforce the penalty from the spot of the foul. If the foul is any other foul by either team, enforce the foul from the previous spot. So let's sum up this discussion on penalty enforcement. Remember the purposes of the new rule. Eliminate excessive offensive penalties, eliminate lenient defensive penalties, and keep punitive offensive penalties for a small class of offensive fouls. The previous spot becomes the enforcement limitation spot, with just a few exceptions. The new rule applies to live ball fouls occurring during scrimmage plays and before a change of team possession. For all other fouls, enforce the penalties using the same all but one principles that you've used in the past. When in doubt, enforce the penalty from the previous spot.